1968, perhaps the most turbulent year of the 60s, Harold Wilson was Prime Minister and Lyndon B. Johnson was President. The war in Vietnam was still raging on and proving to be highly divisive amongst the American public. Johnson was in the final year of his presidency and had decided not to rerun for president in the upcoming election, as the Vietnam War had more or less destroyed his presidency, as the war had so far cost over 30,000 Americans their lives. Johnson would also refuse to send any more troops to Vietnam, which many saw as an admission that the war was now lost. In the 1968 election, Richard Nixon won the presidency, claiming that he had a secret plan to end the war. Now thankfully over here in Britain, earlier in the 60s, Harold Wilson had refused to send any British troops into Vietnam, and this refusal would create tension between him and Johnson. So with dismay regarding the war increasing, John Lennon decided that it was his turn to have his say about it. So welcome back to the White Album in depth, and this is episode 25, Revolution 1. Okay, side 4, here we go folks, final side of the White Album, we are into the home straight now. Now before I go any further, I should also say, although I haven't actually finished this video yet, so I don't know this for certain, chances are this is going to be the longest video that I do in this series, because technically here I'm speaking about two songs that are also technically the same song. It's complicated, I'll explain it here as we go. I was originally just going to be talking about Revolution 1, but then when I was writing the script I thought, I kind of need to talk about the other one as well, because it doesn't really work if I only tell you half the tale, we need the full tale. So that's why this video is going to be so long. So yeah, hope you don't mind. Anyway, in spring 1968, the Beatles went to Rishikesh in India to study meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. So whilst the Beatles were in India, society itself was going through quite a profound change. 1967 was the summer of love. This was the hippie peace and love movement. But that was kind of changing in 1968. It was being replaced by turmoil, political turmoil, uprising, revolution, protests, all this stuff, fighting in the streets to try and get a better world, basically. Yeah, how did that go? We're in a better world now, aren't we? So whilst in India, John Lennon was watching all this unfold and he was feeling inspired. It was energising him, it was politicising him, and he wanted to write a song about this to get his feelings out there, to let people know how he feels, because up until this point the Beatles had stayed out of politics. Now he knew full well in doing this that he would alienate certain Beatles fans, and hey, he did. Now earlier in their career, when they'd still been touring, Brian Epstein would tell the band not to talk about politics, and in particular do not talk about the Vietnam War, because they would risk alienating some of their American fans, particularly probably the more conservative American fans. But now that Brian Epstein was gone, there was nothing to stop the Beatles from talking about it, and in particular John Lennon. So yeah, he was finally now ready to get his voice out there, to be heard, to rise up and yeah, be political. Yeah, go John, hey! So once the Beatles returned from India, they would eventually regroup at George's house in Esher during the last week of May in 1968 to record 27 acoustic demos. The vast amount of these demos would be songs that would end up on the White Album, and one of the songs recorded that day was Revolution. Now this demo, it's actually a really nice demo. John plays it as kind of a fast acoustic song, and it does sound like Revolution. It's very nice, it's a very good demo. Although it's only got the first two verses, the third verse is lacking. I'm guessing he hasn't written it by this point. Now as a side note, this demo was actually the first Esher demo that I ever heard. What happened, if I remember right, was I think I was on probably Instagram, this will be around 2015 time, 2016 maybe, and I seen someone put a video on, and it was a video of John Lennon with some audio overdubbed, and it was this acoustic version of Revolution, and I'd never heard this before, and I was like, what the hell is that? And then someone in the comments was saying it was one of these demos. Now at this point, the only way you could hear these demos was on bootleg. They hadn't been officially released, so I heard it and I was like, this is incredible. Anyway, obviously now they have been officially released. If you want to hear this demo, then you can. I highly recommend it, it's very good. It's on the 50th anniversary edition of the White Album, along with all the other demos that were recorded that day for your listening pleasure. Yeah! So the Beatles would actually begin recording Revolution 1 just a few days later on May 30th, 1968 at Abbey Road, or EMI Studios as it was known then. This would actually be the very first session for the White Album, so this would be the first song that they would record for it. Now at this stage the song was still known as the title Revolution. It hadn't been given the name Revolution 1, we'll get to why it ended up being called that later in the video, but at this stage it was just called Revolution. Anyway, to begin with, the band worked on the basic track for Revolution. For this, John Lennon played acoustic guitar and sang a vocal, Paul McCartney played piano, George Harrison also played acoustic guitar, and Ringo Starr played drums. Now the band would record 16 takes of the basic track, but they would number them takes 1 to 18. For some reason there's no take 11 or take 12, so no idea why they did this, but they did. And take 18 was the one that they would move forward with. Now take 18 is actually quite interesting because it's actually 10 minutes and 17 seconds long. Now the final 6 minutes or so of the song, it's just kind of noise, it's just them jamming and screaming and messing about with distortion and stuff like that. But the reason why I bring this up is because those 6 minutes, although they wouldn't make it on the final version of Revolution 1, only the first 4 minutes of the song would make it, those 6 minutes would serve as the basis of Revolution 9. So we'll come back to that in a later video. Woo. Can't wait to do that one, yay. Anyway, if you want to hear the full unedited version of Revolution 1 Take 18, well, you can. It's on the 50th anniversary edition of the White Album for your listening pleasure. I should make that my catchphrase, shouldn't I? My listening pleasure, your listening pleasure, not my listening pleasure. Although it does bring me great listening pleasure, all this stuff. So the following day, May 31st, 1968, work would continue on the song. Firstly, John Lennon would decide to double track his vocals, so he would do that, and then Paul would overdub the bass guitar onto the song. So after this, Paul, George and Paul's new girlfriend, Frances Schwartz, would record the backing vocals for the song, specifically the shooby-doo-wop portion of the song. So the next session would take place on June 4th, 1968, and in this session John would decide that he was going to re-record his lead vocals. Now to do this, he would actually do it in quite a unique way. He decided that he would lie down on his back whilst recording his vocals. He was hoping that in doing this it would add a different effect to his voice, so his voice would sound different. Now the picture that you're seeing on your screen right now is the actual picture of John recording these vocals. That is him lying on his back trying to record these vocals, so yeah. It didn't really make a difference, I don't think. I mean, I can't hear his vocals any different on this song to any other song on the White Album. It just sounds like John's voice, but there we go. What do I know, hey? Rock and roll. John obviously knows more than me. Apparently lying on your back makes your voice sound different. Lying on your voice? How do you lie on your voice? Now whilst doing this, John would also change some of the lyrics of the song, particularly the line, "Don't you know that you can count me out?" In was now how he sang it. Previously he just said, "Don't you know that you can count me out?" But he now decided to also include in, like he was indecisive. He couldn't decide whether he was out or he was in about destruction. He doesn't know whether he wants to be part of causing destruction or not be part of it. So yeah, that was quite an interesting thing, deciding to make it a bit indecisive. Yeah, I quite like how he does that, to be honest. So Paul, George and Francie would also record some more backing vocals. Now these backing vocals would be them just going mama, dada, over and over and over and over. This was in the outro of the song, so it was at the end. But when they came to mix it later on, they actually cut the song off before it got to this point. So yeah, these backing vocals would never make the finished version. Ringo would also overdub another drum track onto the song. John added some more guitar, this time though using a tone pedal, and Paul added some organ onto the track. So the final session for Revolution 1 would take place on June 21st, 1968. These would be where the final overdubs would be applied. Now at this point the song was still just called Revolution. Anyway, in terms of the overdubs recorded this day, firstly a group of session musicians would overdub 2 trumpets and 4 trombones onto the track. George would then overdub some distorted lead guitar onto the track. And with that, that was Revolution complete. Or was it? So with the song complete, John would now start pushing for this song to be a single. At this point, the last single the Beatles had released had been at the start of 1968, that was Lady Madonna. John wanted Revolution 1, as it would become, to be the next Beatles single. However, Paul and George were against this. They said, nope, we are not putting out a political song as our next single. Paul also said that he thought it was too slow to be a single, it wasn't commercial enough. And George backed Paul up on this. So yeah, John was absolutely raged by this. He was very angry that Paul and George were preventing this from being put out as a single. So this would show some more of the divides that were developing within the band. John was becoming more and more political and going down a political path, whereas George was going the other way. He was becoming more and more spiritual and going down a spiritual path. And Paul, well, Paul was just Paul really. He was just carrying on being Paul, doing Paul stuff and making great music. But this was becoming very divisive in the band, these 3 clashing personalities, and it was probably one of the things, well it is one of the things that drove the band into the ground in the end. However, John hadn't finished with Revolution being a single. He thought he needed to do something about it. Paul had made a comment about it being too slow and not commercial enough to be a single, so John decided that he would rewrite the song now as a faster, more up-tempo song. So yeah, he got to work on that. So by July 9th, 1968, John had rewritten Revolution into this faster song, so the Beatles would return to work on it and they would start afresh. So for this first day session, they would simply just rehearse the song, that was all they did. Now, they wouldn't use any of these rehearsals going forward, but one of the rehearsals has been released. It's on the 50th anniversary edition of the White Album. It's quite nice actually, I really like this rehearsal. In some ways, I kind of prefer this rehearsal version of it more than the single version that went out in the end. So work on Revolution would continue the following day, July 10th, 1968, and this time they were working on the basic track. They wanted to get it nailed down. John and George would play two distorted lead guitars, a sound that was achieved by plugging the guitars directly into the recording console at Abbey Road. Ringo would also record his drum parts. After this was done, John would then record his lead vocals for the track. Now after he'd finished doing his lead vocals, he would then record another vocal track, but this time he would only sing certain words. This was to emphasise those words in the finished version, so it's like, don't you know that you can count me out when you talk about destruction? Don't you know that you can count me out? Stuff like that to emphasise basically the final word, like the key word in each line, which would normally be the final word on each line of the verse. So yeah, that's why he did that. He also would record the scream on this day at the start of the song. I'm not going to reinterpret that or try and do it myself, but I always thought Paul did that scream actually, but apparently it's John. There we go, learn something new every day. So work on Revolution would then continue the following day as well, July 11th, 1968. Again, more overdubs were being done. This time, session musician Nicky Hopkins was brought in. Nicky would get to play some electric piano on the song, including a piano solo. So yeah, that was very nice. Nicky Hopkins, great pianist, played on so many incredible records from all the greats really. So yeah, very nice that he also got to play on a Beatles record. Anyway, after that, Paul would overdub some bass onto the track, but this bass track would go unused. He would later re-record it. So yeah, all that was really used from this day's session was Nicky Hopkins' electric piano. So work on Revolution would then continue the following day, July 12th, 1968. Although, technically, we're going to get technical a bit here, the session would take place after midnight, so it technically actually happened July 13th, 1968. Anyway, this is where the final overdubs for the track would be recorded. So firstly, Paul would overdub some new bass guitar. This was to replace the bass guitar he'd recorded the previous day. And then after that, John would do one last overdub, which was some lead guitar. Just some additional lead guitar from John. And with that, Revolution was now complete and ready to go. So with this faster version now complete, John was still pushing for Revolution to be a single. Now Paul and George would finally back down and agree to let it go out as a single. However, John was really trying to push his luck with them here because John was clamouring for this to also be the A-side, or at least a double A-side. But that wouldn't happen in the end. It would end up being a B-side, the B-side to Hey Jude. So yeah, I think John was quite annoyed, shall we say, that it didn't go out as a double A-side, that single. The Hey Jude single with Revolution as its B-side would be released on August 30th, 1968 in the UK. It came out slightly earlier on August 26th, 1968 in the US. This was the first release from Apple, the Beatles' own record label. They released 4 records that day. This was the first one that the Beatles put out. And probably the most famous song that the Beatles would put out, Hey Jude. Is it the most famous Beatles song? Maybe it is, I don't know. That's maybe a controversial statement. Let me know, what do you think is the most famous Beatles song? Anyway, we're not here to talk about Hey Jude. Revolution was the B-side, and it did divide people. There were people divided by the fact that John was now singing political songs, and it was actually more the protesters that were divided by this because they thought it was a bit hypocritical that John was singing about protests and stuff, but he'd never taken part in one himself. He didn't go out on the street and join these protests around London and whatnot, so yeah, they were a bit annoyed that he was standing there preaching and not actually doing anything. Yeah. Nevertheless, in later years, John still was annoyed that this single didn't go out as a double A-side. Now, he was full of praise for Hey Jude. He did think that was a very, very good song, but he also felt Revolution was a very good song and it should have been a double A-side single, this, which, to be honest, I do agree, it probably should have gone out as a double A-side, although Hey Jude is probably the more commercial song. I imagine if Revolution wasn't political, it probably would have been a double A-side single, this. But yeah, John was very much annoyed that this was a B-side, basically. However, John wasn't finished with the song because Fast Revolution had gone out, but the slower, original Revolution still existed, and John decided that he would release it still. It would still get put out on the White Album, but it would now be renamed to Revolution 1. 1 because it's the original version. probably would have been better as Revolution 2 because it's technically the second version of it, although it is really the first version, so the single version probably should have gone out as Revolution 2. But then that wouldn't have worked because the single went out before the album, so yeah, I'm rambling on here. But basically, yeah, that's why it's called Revolution 1, because it's the original version of Revolution that went out as a single. There we go, eh? The White Album was released on the 22nd of November 1968, and Revolution 1 would be the opening track on side 4 of the album. It was also the 25th song overall on the White Album. Now obviously by the time the White Album came out, the Revolution single had been out for about 3 months by that point, so most people would be familiar with the song. They already knew it, just this was it in its original form. It's slower version, so yeah, most people knew it already by the time it came out. It's the only time the Beatles ever did this, where on an album they included a song that had gone out as a single but in a different arrangement. Not many bands would really do that, to be honest. In fact, is there many other examples of that where a band have done a single and then on an album put out a different arrangement of it? I can't think of any other bands that have done that. Tell me in the comments if you can think of any, because I can't. So Revolution 1, the slower version, the original version, the version on the White Album. I don't know if this is a controversial statement, but I've actually always preferred Revolution 1 to the faster single version of Revolution that went out. I just think it works better as a slower song. I think the message that John's trying to get across comes across a lot better on the slower version. On the faster version, it's kind of overpowered, overshadowed by the distortion, the guitars, the loudness of it. Whereas here, it's very much John's vocals and lyrics that are the emphasis of the song. One of the things as well that I love about Revolution 1 is the backing vocals, the shoo-be-doo-wop, bow, shoo-be-doo-wop. I wish that had gone on the faster version. I don't see why it didn't. And the worst thing is, in the music video, the promotional video for the Fast Revolution, they even do the backing vocals. Paul and George do it on the video, so on the fast version for the video for the fast version. So why is it not on the recording of it? I think it's lacking that. I think that's what it needs. On the unnumbered rehearsal, on the 50th anniversary edition of the White Album, the shooby-doo-wops are still there. So they obviously were intended at first to still be there, but they didn't go on the finished version, unfortunately, which I think is a shame because I think they're really good. Yeah, it's just nice. Now I've got to say as well, I do agree with Paul and George that Revolution 1 is not really single material. It is too slow, it's not very commercial. Yeah, the faster version of Revolution as a single, it does make more sense for that as a single. It works fine like that, but in this slower version, yeah, it wouldn't have worked as a single. I can't imagine this getting played on a radio, for example. To be fair to Paul and George as well, I can see why they didn't want to get dragged into politics. Fair enough if John wants to do that on his own, but the problem with the Beatles is if one of them does it, then they all get dragged into it. So if John's saying something a bit controversial, the 4 of them are then going to get dragged into it. So yeah, I can understand from their point of view why they were maybe quite reluctant to put this out as a single. I guess as well, like I've said earlier in the video, the fact that Revolution 1 didn't go out as a single and John had to re-record it faster, even though he didn't really want to, would be one of the things that would drive the band into the ground in the end, because they were just becoming 4 individuals. They all had their own personalities. They were growing up, they were adults now. They weren't boys anymore. They had their own beliefs, their own things that they wanted to do with their lives, and the others perhaps didn't want to do them same things. But anyway, Revolution 1, I do love this song. It is one of my favourites on the White Album, to be honest, and in some ways it's quite sad because this political message, it is still relevant, unfortunately. The only bit that isn't relevant anymore is the 3rd verse at the very end. If you go carrying pictures of Chairman Mao, you ain't gonna make it with anyone anyhow. Obviously, Chairman Mao is not here with us anymore. I think he was in charge of China, wasn't he? Yeah. So he's not here anymore. But these days, you can just change that name to someone more relevant, and then the song is just as relevant as ever. Change it to Rishi Sunak, although by the time you're seeing this, if we've got any luck, he won't be Prime Minister anymore. So that concludes another episode of the White Album in depth. Once again, thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed this and you're not subscribed to my channel, well, please do consider subscribing. It would mean a lot. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. Since we've talked about the Revolution single here, I've been debating, and ahhing about the idea of doing an extra video at the end. The plan is, once I've done all 30 tracks, I'll do another episode which will be on all the Isha demos they recorded that didn't make the White Album, just looking at what happened to them. But I'm also thinking, should I do another one other video which focuses on Hey Jude, since that was recorded during the White Album sessions, just obviously it wasn't on the album, it went out as a non-album single, because I've technically spoken about the B-side to that single in this video. So yeah, let me know. Should I do Hey Jude when I'm finished as well? I don't know. Do let me know though. Anyway, if you have enjoyed this and you've not seen any previous episodes in this series, well, there is a playlist on my channel that consists of all previous episodes, and all future episodes will also be added to that playlist. There's not many more future episodes to come now though. Anyway, join me next time where we're going to try and change the direction of the wind and get it to blow back in this direction to bring a boat back across the Atlantic here to Britain. Until then though, do take care. It's gonna be alright.